Okay, so circumcision. It's one of those things, right? People have strong opinions, but how many have actually, like, really dug into it?
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting,
Yeah.
because it's often presented as this, simple, almost routine procedure.
Right.
But when you start peeling back the layers, there's a whole lot more to uncover.
Absolutely. And that's where Kenneth S. Lipman's book, Circumcision, How an Ancient Ritual Became a Questionable Surgery, that's where it gets really fascinating.
He really dives deep, and he doesn't shy away from, asking the tough questions.
No, he doesn't.
And what makes it even more interesting is that Lipman himself is Jewish.
Right.
So he's writing from a place of personal understanding, but also taking this critical look at the history, the medical claims, the ethical considerations.
It's about giving the full context,
Yeah.
not necessarily about saying one side is right or one side is wrong.
Exactly.
So if you're listening and you've ever thought, like, what's the big deal about the foreskin anyway? Really,
Yeah.
this deep dive is for you.
Yeah, it's more than just, as some people think, a simple piece of skin.
Right.
Lipman actually describes this complex anatomy with surprisingly sophisticated functions.
Yeah. And maybe I'm just behind the times here, that the adult foreskin is like roughly the size of an index card.
Yeah, it's about that size.
I had no idea.
Yeah, and it's not just, an arbitrary size. It's because it houses a variety of things.
It's designed to do something.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you have thousands of nerve fibers, including things like Pacinian corpuscles,
Oh.
which are known for their sensitivity to pressure, and Meissner's corpuscles, those same ones we have in our fingertips that make them so adept at, fine touch.
So we're talking about something that's incredibly sensitive.
Incredibly sensitive.
Okay, so what does that mean then in terms of function? Like, what is it actually doing?
So, for starters, all those nerve endings, it means the foreskin plays a significant role in sexual pleasure, sexual function.
Okay.
But it's more than just that.
Oh, okay.
It also contains specialized glands, Tyson's glands, that secrete lubricants. And it has a role in protecting the sensitive head of the penis, right? It's designed for a reason.
So it's meant to be there. It has a function.
It does.
But then why is it so commonly removed? Like, what are the usual things that people say, like, well, this is why we do this?
So Lipman tackles those head-on in the book, and he makes a case that a lot of the common justifications, particularly the medical ones, don't really hold up to scrutiny.
Interesting.
One of the most frequent ones you'll hear is hygiene.
Oh, right. Like it's somehow unhygienic or unclean to have a foreskin.
Right, exactly. But as Lipman points out, proper hygiene practices can easily address any concerns there, making removal unnecessary.
So you're saying it's not that it's inherently a problem, it's that it's not being taken care of properly.
Exactly.
And so
Yeah.
then people jump to, like, oh, it must be a medical reason.
Right, and he delves into the studies, on UTIs, urinary tract infections, penile cancer, even HIV transmission. And what he often finds is there are flaws in the research methods.
Like how so?
So some studies, for instance, they don't adequately control for other factors.
Oh, interesting.
So it leads to these misleading conclusions.
It's not as black and white as it might seem on the surface.
Exactly, exactly.
Give me an example of one of the studies.
So one example he cites is a study that's often used to support circumcision's benefits in reducing UTIs.
Okay.
And this study, it claimed lower rates in circumcised infants, but what it didn't account for was things like differences in hygiene practices between the groups.
Oh, so they could totally skew the results.
Exactly. It's about looking at the bigger picture.
Right. It's not just this one little thing. There's a lot of other factors.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about STIs, though? What about, things that are transmitted sexually? Is there any evidence there?
So Lipman does find that there is a potential link between circumcision and a reduced risk of HPV transmission.
Okay. And HPV, that's a big one these days.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah.
But he really encourages us to consider this in a broader context.
Okay.
So while circumcision might offer this slight reduction in risk, it doesn't eliminate it entirely.
Right.
And it's important to remember that HPV transmission can occur through other forms of sexual contact as well.
So even when it comes to something like HPV, it's not just a simple yes or no, like, oh, if you do this, then you're fine. It's much more nuanced than that.
It's way more nuanced.
Wow.
And I think it highlights the importance of, really open conversations about sexual health in general.
Sure.
Safe sex practices, vaccination, all of those things are crucial.
It sounds like already, just from what you're saying, this is already challenging a lot of preconceived notions that I think people come to this topic with.
Absolutely.
It's interesting how Lipman's able to kind of, present this argument and get people thinking a little more critically about the information that's out there.
And we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, there's more. Okay.
Right. There's so much more because he takes us on this journey through history as well, uncovering these ancient and surprisingly diverse roots of circumcision.
Like what?
Did you know that there's evidence suggesting it was practiced independently in various cultures? Like, we even see depictions of it in Egyptian hieroglyphs dating back thousands of years.
So it has a much longer and more like global history than I think a lot of people realize.
Oh, absolutely.
Is there any kind of like sense of why? Like, why was it so widespread?
That's one of the mysteries that he explores.
Okay.
It appears that it emerged in different parts of the world for different reasons.
Right. Okay.
In some cultures, it might have been tied to, like, rites of passage.
Okay.
In others, it might have been associated with notions of purity or hygiene. So there isn't one single answer that explains it all.
Yeah, it took a lot of history where we're trying to put together from these fragments why something happened, how it happened.
The puzzle.
But what of the religious aspect?
Yeah, that's where things get even more interesting. Because he really delves into the historical and religious contexts of circumcision, starting with Judaism.
And this is interesting because he himself comes from a Jewish background, so he's really able to speak to this, I imagine, in a way that a lot of people can't.
He does it really well, this kind of weaving together of historical analysis, religious scholarship, and then his own, like, personal insights.
So he's not afraid to ask those tough questions even within his own tradition and background.
Not at all. And he really dives into some fascinating questions about the origins of circumcision within Judaism.
Like what? Give me an example.
So, for example, he delves into the Torah itself, and he points out that it likely had multiple authors, each with their own perspectives.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which raises questions about how the covenant with Abraham, which is often cited as the basis for a Jewish circumcision, might have been understood and interpreted differently throughout history.
And we forget that sometimes, right? We think of these texts, like religious texts in particular, as being so static. But they were written by people, real people, in a specific time.
In a specific context, and that context matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and as Lipman points out, that context matters a lot because he suggests that the practice of complete foreskin removal, which is what we often think of today,
Right.
as well as the ritual of metzitza,
Yeah.
the oral suction, were likely later developments
Oh, wow.
in Jewish circumcision practices, influenced by cultural factors and even potentially reactions to historical persecution.
So what you're saying is that circumcision, as it's practiced in, say, some Jewish communities today, might not be an exact reflection of what was originally intended or practiced, thousands of years ago.
That's what his research suggests.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It really shows how these practices evolve and change over time.
They do. They're not static.
Okay, so we've talked about Judaism. What about other religions? How do their practices, their beliefs around circumcision, how do those compare?
That's where we're going to shift our focus next. And we'll look at Islam and how it differs from this tradition.
So we're moving from Jewish circumcision practices, we're shifting gears a little bit, to explore how things are done within Islam. What are some of the key differences that Lipman, highlights in his book?
Well, one of the most notable differences is the age at which circumcision is typically performed.
Oh, okay.
So while Jewish circumcision, as we discussed, traditionally takes place shortly after birth,
Right.
in Islam, it's more common for boys to be circumcised later, often between the ages of 5 and puberty.
Okay, so that's a pretty significant difference right there.
It is.
In terms of just the timing and when it's done, what about the procedure itself? Are there, variations there as well?
Absolutely. And unlike the more, standardized procedures you often find in some Jewish communities, Muslim circumcision practices can vary quite a bit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, from region to region.
What?
And in many Muslim communities, you won't find a designated religious figure who's equivalent to the mohel in Judaism.
So it's not as, formalized in terms of who's doing it and exactly how it's done.
Exactly. It's much more, I guess you could say, decentralized.
So the whole experience then, the rituals around it, the procedures themselves, can be quite diverse then within Islam.
Absolutely. There's a wide range of practices and beliefs surrounding it.
Lipman, does he talk at all about the experience itself? Like, what about the pain aspect of it?
He does, and he doesn't shy away from addressing the pain involved,
Okay.
regardless of, the religious or cultural context.
Right.
He really challenges this notion that infants don't feel pain or that they won't remember it.
Which I think is something that people say sometimes.
Yeah, you hear that a lot. But he cites studies that suggest quite the opposite.
Okay.
That infants undergoing circumcision, they experience a significant physiological stress response.
Wow.
And there's growing evidence that early pain experiences like that can have lasting impacts
Oh, wow.
on pain perception.
So this isn't just about, like, the immediate experience. It could have long-term consequences as well.
Exactly. It can affect how they perceive pain later in life, even brain development, some studies suggest.
It's something that I think a lot of times is just kind of, I don't want to say dismissed, but maybe not given the weight that it deserves in these conversations.
Right. It can be an uncomfortable topic.
And what makes it, to me, even more kind of ethically complex is that this pain is being inflicted without the child's consent.
Exactly. And that's a key point that Lipman brings up, this idea of informed consent.
Right.
He questions, the reliance solely on things like sugar water or topical anesthetics during circumcision, arguing that those methods are often insufficient to really manage the pain adequately.
It makes you wonder, like, if circumcision wasn't so ingrained in our culture and our history, would this even be a conversation we'd be having?
That's the heart of the matter, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
if we were starting from scratch, would this be the chosen procedure?
Right, exactly.
And it leads us to another really crucial aspect that he explores,
What's that?
the impact of circumcision on sexual experience.
Okay, and this is something that, again, I feel like we kind of tiptoe around.
Yeah.
But it's such an important thing to address.
It is, and it's often left out of the conversation.
So what does Lipman have to say about it? This connection between circumcision and, like, sexual sensitivity, function, satisfaction?
So he argues that removing the foreskin with all of its nerve endings inevitably leads to a change in sexual sensation.
Right.
While some men might not notice a significant difference, others report a decrease in sensitivity.
So it's not like it's the same for every single person.
Not at all. Everyone's different. Their experiences are different.
Okay.
But for some, it can be a significant change.
So it's not just the physical changes, but it's like the actual experience of pleasure, intimacy, all of that can be affected.
Absolutely. It's deeply personal.
Okay.
And for some men, this change in sensation can even lead to, difficulties achieving orgasm or even changes in erectile function.
Wow.
He shares some really compelling anecdotal evidence in the book from men who have experienced these challenges firsthand.
So it's not just theoretical. It's like real people dealing with these real consequences.
It's about acknowledging the very real and personal impact that this can have on a man's sexual well-being.
Yeah, it's a good reminder, too, that our sexual experiences are so intertwined with our physical bodies.
They're inseparable, really.
And something that's often, I think, framed as this, like, really minor procedure can actually have these far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. The body is complex, and these things have ripple effects.
Okay, so we've talked about the physical sensations, but there's also, I imagine, a psychological component to this as well, right?
Absolutely. And Lipman, he delves into that as well.
Okay.
The psychological and emotional effects of circumcision, touching on feelings of violation, loss, even anger that some men experience.
Those are some heavy emotions to be dealing with.
They are. And because circumcision is often so deeply ingrained in cultural and religious traditions, those emotions can be really difficult to unpack.
Yeah, and I imagine there's probably a lot of silence around it, both within families, within society at large.
There is, and I think that's what makes Lipman's book so important, because he's bringing these often unspoken experiences to light.
Giving voice to something that's not talked about enough.
Encouraging these open and honest conversations about a topic that's so often shrouded in taboo.
It seems like what I'm getting from this conversation is that this issue is so multifaceted, it's not just one thing.
It really isn't.
Yeah.
We're talking history, religion, medicine, ethics, personal experiences. It's all intertwined.
It's all connected.
And to really understand the complexities of it, we have to be willing to look at it from all those different angles.
To fully wrap our heads around it. Okay, so we've talked about the personal experience, but Lipman also goes into the kind of the societal, the bigger picture stuff.
Yeah.
He talks about, like, the rise of medicalized circumcision in America, which is a whole other, like, can of worms, it seems like.
It is, and it's a fascinating story that he unravels in the book. How did this become so ingrained in American medical practice?
Yeah, because it's interesting, right? Because in the U.S., circumcision rates have, like, fluctuated over the decades.
They have.
And there's still a lot of debate about it. Like, should it be done? Should it not be done? So how did we get to this point where it became so common?
It's a really interesting story because it turns out that the reasons for its rise in popularity, they were often based on, shaky scientific ground, you could say.
Really?
Yeah, they were influenced by cultural biases and even surprisingly concerns about masturbation.
It's wild to me that, like, this fear of masturbation, which is such a natural thing, could actually shape medical practices.
It speaks volumes about the power of like those societal norms,
Yeah.
right? And how they can even influence our understanding of medicine, the human body.
It's almost like they needed to find a medical reason to justify something that was really more about controlling behavior.
It's an interesting way to look at it. And, Lipman points out it wasn't just about changing those attitudes towards masturbation.
Okay. There were also these claims about hygiene and disease prevention that really fueled this rise of circumcision in the U.S.
So it was like this perfect storm almost of cultural anxieties and questionable science.
Exactly. And a medical profession that was, eager to embrace these new procedures, even if the evidence wasn't quite there.
Because it was new and modern and like, this is how we're doing things now.
Exactly. And what Lipman really exposes is that once a practice like that becomes so ingrained, it's incredibly difficult to challenge, even when new research emerges.
Yeah, it's hard to go back and say, like, wait a minute, maybe we were wrong.
Exactly. There's this resistance to change, you
Right.
know?
Right.
And Lippmann really points to a culture of silence around circumcision, a reluctance to really question these long-held beliefs.
And I imagine there's probably not a whole lot of like education even happening in medical schools among doctors about foreskin care because it's just assumed, well, it's not even going to be there, so why would we talk about that?
Yeah, it's like this blind spot in their training, you could say. Which is kind of scary when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
Because even if you're not going to be performing circumcisions, you should at least know how to care for a foreskin.
Absolutely. And it's that lack of open discussion, that lack of really critically examining these practices. That's what Lipman's trying to get at, you know?
Yeah.
He's arguing for greater transparency from the medical community,
Makes sense.
a willingness to say, hey, maybe what we thought before wasn't completely accurate,
Right.
and just a more balanced approach, one that respects both the potential benefits and the risks.
Yeah, because there are always two sides to every coin.
Always.
It's about empowering parents to make informed decisions, not just presenting this as, well, this is just what you do and we don't even need to talk about it.
It should be a conversation, a dialogue.
Absolutely.
And that brings up another kind of, I guess you could say, thread that he unravels in the book.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that?
The financial incentives.
Oh, right, because this is also a business. So you're talking about the fact that hospitals, doctors, they make money from performing circumcisions.
Right, and it goes beyond just the procedure itself.
What does that mean?
Well, Lipman reveals that some hospitals actually profit from selling the foreskin tissue.
Wait, really? Like, what do they use foreskin tissue for?
So it turns out that foreskin tissue, particularly the fibroblasts it contains, are really valuable.
Okay, I'm listening. I'm interested.
They can be used in things like wound healing, tissue engineering, even anti-aging products.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible stuff.
So they're essentially like profiting twice, right? They're profiting from the procedure, and then they're profiting again from selling the tissue.
And that's the ethical dilemma.
Yeah,
And
like, should parents even know about this? Do they have a say in what happens to their child's, body parts?
exactly. It's a complex issue.
It's not black and white. It's not simple.
And that's what I appreciate about Lipman's book. It's not about dictating what's right or wrong. It's about giving you the information, the different perspectives.
So you can make up your own mind.
Exactly. An informed decision.
This deep dive has been, I'm not going to lie, pretty eye-opening. I feel like I came in with certain assumptions, and this has really challenged a lot of them.
It's a complex topic.
It is, and it's something that, like I said, people have a lot of opinions about, but those opinions aren't always based on, like, a full understanding of the issue.
It's easy to form an opinion without really digging into the research, the history, all of that.
Right, and I think the main takeaway here is that circumcision is not a settled issue,
It's an ongoing conversation, and it should be.
Absolutely, and it's one that deserves our attention, our thoughtful consideration, especially when we're talking about, healthcare decisions for ourselves, for our children.
It's about bodily autonomy. It's about informed consent. It's about respecting a range of beliefs and practices.
And I think this deep dive has given us a lot to think about in that regard.
We've journeyed through history, religion, medicine, ethics, and I think if there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's that there's always more to learn, always more to question.
And that's what these deep dives are all about, so we encourage you to do your own research, come to your own conclusions.
We've just offered one perspective, one lens through which to view this complex issue.
So keep those conversations going. Keep asking those tough questions. And until next time, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.